I spent 4 months knitting my daughter's baby blanket, stitch by stitch. Marilyn Cooper, retired nurse and mother of 2, didn't say a word when she heard the laughter from the nursery. Rachel, the daughter whose fevers I sat up with through the night, whispered to her husband, "We'll tell Mom we bought a better one." By morning, the handmade blanket would be boxed away, alongside every heirloom she'd once planned to inherit. I'd been both caregiver and mother. Now I was the keeper of my own treasures. And when she opened the nursery chest, Rachel finally realized which blanket had been left behind. I'm curious, where in the world are you joining us from? Drop your city or country in the comments and make sure you're subscribed for all the latest updates. 4 months of stitching, each thread woven with love, only to be met with a cold dismissal. The yarn slid over Clara's fingers in a steady rhythm, soft as whispering grass. The afternoon light streamed through the lace curtains, catching on the silvery strands in her hair. Her needles clicked and paused, a quiet percussion to the hum of her thoughts. The baby blanket was almost finished. A pale cream fine wool blend, edged with a pattern she'd perfected over decades. Each stitch carried a small intention: warmth for tiny toes, comfort for restless naps, something that would smell faintly of home even years from now. She imagined the moment she'd place it in Lily's hands. Lily's eyes lighting up, fingers brushing the weave, maybe even tears welling at the sight. Clara's chest filled at the thought, the way it had when she first felt her daughter kick under her ribs 32 years ago. Becoming a grandmother had felt like the natural next chapter of her life. For weeks she'd floated through errands and chores, the blanket draped across her lap like a promise. She'd turned down offers from neighbors to help, insisting, "It has to be from me." Outside, wind rattled the bare branches against the window. Clara kept her gaze on the blanket, her hands moving with the precision of muscle memory. She remembered nights when Lily was little, knitting sweaters in the dim glow of a table lamp, while Ben dozed in the recliner. The tiny cardigans she'd made for school, the patterned mittens for snow days, each one worn until the fabric thinned. She wove the final row, threading the tail through and pulling it snug. It was perfect. She smoothed it across her lap, letting her fingers roam over the pattern, checking for any uneven stitches. Satisfied, she folded it into a neat square and pressed it gently to her cheek. On the side table, her phone lit up with the time. If she called now, Lily would still be on her lunch break. Clara reached for it, tucking the blanket beside her like a cherished secret. "Hi, sweetheart," she said when her daughter picked up. Lily's voice carried the distracted lilt of someone multitasking. "Hey Mom, what's up?" Clara felt her smile widen. "Just checking in. I was wondering about the shower. Do you need me to bring anything extra? I've been working on something special for the baby." There was a rustle on the other end, a pause just long enough for a seed of unease to settle in Clara's chest. "Oh," Lily said finally. "Well, we actually bought a blanket. It's from that high-end store downtown, the one with the organic cotton and all that. We'll tell everyone that's the one we're using." The words landed with the quiet finality of a door closing. Clara's breath caught, but she didn't speak right away. The weight of the folded blanket beside her seemed to grow heavier. The line stayed open, but Clara could only stare at the wool in her lap, its soft edges blurring as her vision swam. The silence between us stretched longer than the thread I'd used to make her blanket. Clara let the phone call end without fanfare, the click of disconnection small but cutting. The room felt different now, colder somehow, the afternoon light suddenly flat. She set the blanket on the arm of the chair and smoothed the folds, the familiar motion bringing no comfort. Maybe she didn't mean it like that, Clara told herself. Pregnant women had moods. Perhaps Lily had simply been caught up in the excitement of buying something new. Still, the words clung to her skin, stubborn as burrs. The next morning she drove into town. It was an impulse, half curiosity, half masochism, that pulled her toward the boutique Lily had mentioned. The bell above the door chimed, and the scent of lavender and polished wood rushed over her. Rows of impossibly soft fabrics lined the shelves, each one arranged like art. She found the blanket section near the back. The first one she touched was buttery to the fingertips, the knit so uniform it looked machine-made, which of course it was. A tiny tag dangled from the corner. Organic Peruvian cotton. Clara's eyes lingered on the price, the numbers almost absurd in their neatness. She lifted it from the display, feeling its weight. Perfect, yes. Immaculate, yes. But impersonal, like something that could belong to anyone. There was no quiet evening stitched into its rose, no trace of a mother's hand in its making. And yet, this was the one Lily had chosen to show off. Clara set it back carefully, and left the shop without buying a thing. The January air bit at her cheeks, as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her breath puffing in front of her. She hugged her coat tighter, the ache in her chest deepening with every step back to her car. The baby shower came 2 weeks later, the community hall decorated in pale greens and yellow. Paper lanterns bobbed from the ceiling, and the table sagged under trays of pastries and bowls of fruit. Clara carried her gift, a simple box tied with a satin ribbon, into the room. Lily greeted her with a quick hug, her belly a firm curve between them. Clara handed her the box, forcing a smile. Presents were opened after cake. Clara sat near the back, the blanket box balanced on Lily's lap as she untied the ribbon. When the lid came off, a murmur of approval moved through the room. "It's beautiful, Mom," Lily said, holding it up so the pattern caught the light. But there was a flicker in her expression, a tightening around the eyes that only Clara seemed to notice, something restrained, almost apologetic. The next gift was from Lily's friend Marissa, the boutique blanket. The reaction was louder this time, voices cooing over the brand, the feel, the price. Lily's smile widened in a way it hadn't with Clara. She set her mother's blanket carefully aside, the better one draped over her arm as the conversation moved on. Clara clapped along with the others, but her palms felt heavy, her throat dry. Later, as guests mingled over coffee, Clara wandered toward the refreshment table. The hum of conversation floated around her, until a voice Lily's cut clear through it. "She's so sweet," Lily was saying to Marissa, "and it's really nice, but this one is just so much better." Clara's hands froze around the paper cup she was filling, the bitter scent of coffee rising between them. She didn't turn around, just stood there, her back to her daughter, the words settling into her bones like a winter that wouldn't end. "I've been giving all my love, now it's time to face the truth." The baby shower ended in a tangle of pastel tissue paper and leftover cake. Clara stood by the door helping guests slip coats over their shoulders, each hug feeling more like a formality than a farewell. When Lily finally left, arm linked with her husband's, the boutique blanket neatly folded in a gift bag, Clara felt the air shift. The weight in her chest didn't loosen, it deepened, settling low like a stone. At home, she set her keys in the dish by the door, and went straight to her knitting basket. The half-finished scarf inside should have offered comfort, something to keep her hands busy, but the yarn felt rougher than she remembered. She wound it once around her fingers, then let it drop. Her mind circled back to Lily's voice, that casual dismissal still echoing. The words had been soft enough to pass unnoticed by anyone else, but to Clara they'd landed with precision, sharp and deliberate, finding the one place she still felt tender. Ben was in the den, television low, reading the sports section. Clara stood in the doorway, the blanket from the shower draped over her arm like evidence. She didn't even appreciate it, she said, her voice thinner than she'd intended. "Did you see the way she looked at it? Like it was something to be tolerated." Ben lowered the paper, brow furrowing. "I'm sure she liked it, Clara. She's just what?" Clara pressed. He hesitated. "Maybe distracted, pregnant, caught up in everything," but Clara shook her head. "No, she chose something else, something bought over something I poured myself into for months." I could see it in her face. Ben sighed and set the paper aside, but he didn't argue further. His silence was meant to soothe, but it only made the space between them feel larger. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Clara lay staring at the ceiling, replaying moments from years past. Lily's birthday parties, the hand-sewn dresses she'd worn to school, the homemade Halloween costumes that always got compliments. Clara could see them all so clearly, yet now she wondered if they'd mattered to anyone but her. Had she been invisible all along, her work and care folded neatly away, the moment something newer, shinier came along? In the early hours she slipped from bed and went to her small writing desk. The journal waited there, its cover worn soft from years of use. She opened to a blank page, pen hovering for a moment before the words began to spill. When did my love become too ordinary for her? She wrote it again, slower this time, feeling the weight of each word. Outside, dawn crept in pale and cold, pressing against the glass. The next day she decided to put away some things in the guest room. Boxes of photo albums lined the closet shelves, dust blurring the edges of their covers. She slid one free, flipping through images of holidays and summer trips, Lily's smile growing and changing through the years. Near the back a photo caught her eye. A winter morning, the yard still covered in snow. Lily stood bundled in a knitted hat and scarf, her small hands clutching a thick sweater Clara had made from leftover yarns. The colors clashed in a way that was charming only to a mother's eye. In the picture, Lily was beaming, cheeks flushed, the sweater sleeves bunched at her wrists. She'd worn it every day that winter, refusing even to take it off for school photos. Clara sat on the floor, the photo balanced in her lap. She felt the sting at the back of her eyes before she could blink it away. Her tears blurred the image, but she didn't look away, because for the first time in weeks, she wasn't sure if she was crying for the girl in the picture or for herself. I've given all these years to her, and now I'll take back what's mine. Clara sat with the photo for a long time, until the light in the room shifted and dusk began pooling in the corners. She slid it back into the album, closed the cover, and stood with a new steadiness in her spine. The next morning she carried her coffee into the dining room, and spread out a folder of bank statements, investment summaries, and a yellow legal pad. For hours the only sounds were the scratch of her pen and the occasional creak of her chair. Line by line she totaled and circled and drew arrows. She saw the steady stream of withdrawals for birthday gifts, holiday trips, just because dinners with Lily's family. The numbers told a truth she hadn't let herself face. She had been pouring more than her heart into Lily's life. She'd been pouring her savings too. Her stomach tightened as she added the totals. It wasn't ruinous, but it was enough to see the imbalance plainly. She had been giving and giving and giving, time, money, energy, and receiving back only what Lily deemed convenient. She leaned back, pen resting against her chin. Resentment crept in, slow but certain, like water rising under a closed door. By the third cup of coffee, Clara's mind had shifted. She pictured the years ahead, not as an endless extension of the same patterns, but as something she could actually choose. She wasn't just a mother or a soon-to-be grandmother. She was a woman who still had time to see new places, make new friends, and build something for herself. She pulled her laptop closer, opening tabs for destinations she'd once torn from travel magazines. Small coastal towns with whitewashed cottages, mountain villages with slow trains winding through them. She searched solo travel for women over 50, and scrolled through pictures of smiling faces against unfamiliar skyline. Her knitting basket sat in the corner, the baby blanket still folded inside. She stared at it for a long moment, then crossed the room. Her fingers smoothed over the stitches, but this time there was no ache, only decision. She would not hand this over to someone who couldn't see the care in it. Instead, she'd give it to someone who would cherish it. A local shelter for young mothers came to mind. Somewhere it might be wrapped around a child without being compared to a price tag. That evening, she called Ben. His voice warmed at the sound of hers, but when she told him her plan, keeping the blanket, donating it instead, he paused. Really? Yes, Clara said, steady. I'm not doing this for her anymore. I'm doing it for me. There was surprise in his tone, but also something like respect. If that's what you want, I'll back you. After they hung up, Clara felt a lightness she hadn't expected. A week later, she stopped by Lily's house while they were out, dropping off some packages Lily had ordered and had mistakenly sent to Clara's address. She let herself in, as she often did, setting the boxes on the kitchen counter. On the way out, she noticed a half-open closet door in the hallway. A sliver of glossy paper caught her eye. Inside, stacked neatly on the upper shelves, were gift boxes, dozens of them, some still in their original wrapping, others opened but clearly unused. Clara recognized the quilt she'd sewn for Lily and Ben's anniversary, still in its tissue, the wooden cradle Ben had refinished. A hand-thrown ceramic vase she'd brought back from Santa Fe. She reached up, touching the corner of the quilt's box, Dust clung to her fingertips. None of these had been part of Lily's life. They'd been stored away as if meaning could be boxed and forgotten. Clara's breath slowed, but her pulse quickened. The resentment she'd felt before was nothing compared to the cold clarity settling over her neck. She closed the closet door with deliberate care, her mind already fixed. She would be back, but next time she wouldn't be leaving quietly. She won't get away with ignoring me any longer. I'm taking my truth to her door. Saturday morning dawned sharp and windless, the kind of winter day that carried sound farther than you expected. Clara sat in her car at the end of Lily's street, the engine idling low, her fingers tracing the soft ridges of the blanket folded in her lap. It was weighty without being heavy, months of her life stitched into it. Today it was more than wool and thread. It was her line in the sand. She pulled into Lily's driveway, gravel crunching under the tires. The curtains in the front window twitched, just enough to tell her she'd been seen. Her pulse climbed. When Lily opened the door, the smile she offered was quick and brittle, like a photograph snapped under bad lighting. "Mom, this is unexpected." Clara didn't step over the threshold yet. She held the blanket a little higher, not to offer it, but to make sure it was noticed. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice was calm, too calm to be mistaken for casual. Lily glanced over her shoulder into the house. It's been not a great time for months," Clara cut in. "We're doing this now." A flicker of irritation crossed Lily's face, but she stepped aside. The living room was neat in the way of a house staged for company. Every cushion fluffed, a scented candle burning on the mantel. Clara stayed standing. "This has gone on too long," she began, each word deliberate. "You've been pushing me to the edges of your life and I've let it happen. But I need to know, why can't you value what I give you? Why does it only count if it's something you bought?" Lily's eyes slid toward the blanket in Clara's arms, then back up. "Mom, it's not about that. You go overboard. All the time. And she hesitated, searching for the word. "It's overwhelming." The word landed like a cold hand on Clara's chest. Overwhelming, as if love given without an invoice was a burden, as if years of sweaters, meals, late-night phone calls, and always showing up were too much to bear. The silence stretched, and Lily filled it. "I know you mean well, but it feels like everything has to be about the things you make, the things you do. Sometimes I just want space." Clara didn't move. She didn't argue. She let the air between them go still enough to hear the faint hiss of the radiator. Something in her shifted, not an explosion, but a slow tectonic movement, the kind that changes the shape of a whole landscape, without warning. She looked down at the blanket, her fingers splayed over the careful stitches, and for the first time, it didn't feel like an offering. It felt like proof. Clara lifted her gaze to Lily, steady and unblinking, realizing she was no longer here to be understood. She was here to decide what came next. Her words hurt, but they opened up a truth I'd been hiding from for years. Clara stood in Lily's living room, the air thick with the scent of the candle and something sharper. Her own blood heat climbing in her chest. The words still rang there, echoing against bone. Overwhelming. It would have been easier to lash back, to raise her voice and meet hurt with hurt, but the anger slid inward instead, settling behind her ribs. She felt it building, not a storm but a tide, quiet, steady, inevitable. Her eyes drifted across the room, the framed photographs on the mantel, the curated cushions, the glossy coffee table book open to a page that looked staged. She remembered this house when it was cluttered with half-finished art projects and couch cushions turned into forts. Now it looked like the kind of home you visited, not lived in. Lily shifted her weight, clearly waiting for a reply. But Clara only gave the smallest nod and turned toward the door, her fingers still curled protectively around the blanket. The drive home blurred past, the shapes of houses, the gray sky heavy with unshed snow. By the time she stepped inside her own home, the air felt thinner, easier to breathe. She set the blanket on the couch and stood in the entryway for a long moment, taking in her own space. Here, the walls still held her. The scent of cinnamon from last night's tea lingered in the kitchen. A basket of yarn sat by the chair, a book face down on the side table. But as her gaze traveled over it all, she realized she'd been living inside a museum of other people's needs. Everything. The meals planned, the colors chosen, the hours spent had been arranged around roles she never thought to question. That night she couldn't settle. She moved from room to room, touching objects she'd bought for someone else's comfort, opening drawers filled with things she'd kept just in case Lily might want them someday. She saw the years she'd built her life around being needed. And now that need had turned into too much. She pulled out her journal, the one that had been gathering dust on the bottom shelf of her desk. Sitting in the pool of lamplight, she let the pen rest in her hand before writing. I am more than what they've allowed me to be. The sentence came fast, then slower the second time, as if she were stitching it into herself. She thought about the way Lily had looked at her, not with cruelty, but with the casual assurance of someone who expected her to absorb whatever was handed out. The anger was still there, but beneath it something else was starting to take shape. Curiosity. What would her life look like if she filled it with things for herself? If she stopped waiting to be invited into other people's stories and began writing her own? She closed the journal and went to her bedroom. The suitcase was still in the back of the closet, the one she and Ben had used for weekend trips before his back started giving him trouble. She pulled it out, unzipping it to the scent of cedar from the sachet she'd tucked inside years ago. Her hands were steady as she began to fill it, not with a plan fully formed, but with the possibility of one: comfortable shoes, a warm sweater, the scarf she loved because it was hers alone. She didn't need to know exactly where she was going. She only knew she wasn't staying here, not like this. Clara zipped the suitcase closed with a final quiet pull, the sound slicing through the stillness. Her first trip alone had just begun, even if she hadn't yet chosen the destination. I'm not just a mother. I'm a woman ready to reclaim her own life. By Sunday afternoon, the suitcase sat at the foot of the bed like a dare. Clara balanced her laptop on her knees, scrolling past glossy beaches and bustling cities until she found it. A small coastal town she'd once read about in a travel magazine. The kind of place with tide pools, weather-worn piers, and a single bookstore that doubled as a cafe. She booked the ticket before she could talk herself out of it. No companion fare. No family discounts, just her name, her seat, her journey. The next call was harder. Ben answered on the second ring, his voice warm but edged with the familiarity of years. I'm going away for a while, she said, cutting through the pleasantries. A week, maybe more. There was a pause, paper rustling faintly in the background. Where to? A little town by the coast. I've always wanted to see it. That sounds nice, he said, but there was something in his tone, soft, almost fragile. I need this for me, Ben, she added. Not for Lily, not for anyone else, just me. He exhaled, and though there was a sadness in it, she could hear the quiet acceptance too. Then go. Really go. Her first solo flight felt like a mix of trespassing and liberation. The seat beside her stayed empty, her coat pooled there like a placeholder for the life she'd left behind. She watched the land unravel beneath the clouds, the patchwork of fields giving way to water, the coastline cutting a deliberate line between past and present. The town met her with salt air and gull cries, the streets narrow and cobbled. Her rented room overlooked the harbor, where fishing boats bobbed in the winter tide. She unpacked slowly, savoring the novelty of putting her belongings into drawers no one else would open. Days unfurled without schedule. Mornings began with long walks along the shore, her boots crunching over damp sand. She collected smooth stones and bits of sea glass, slipping them into her pocket with no thought of where they'd end up. Afternoons were for wandering, the pier with its weather-beaten benches, the shop selling hand-painted ceramics, the bakery where the owner insisted she try a scone still warm from the oven. In the corner of a thrift store, she found a set of pencils and a sketch pad, the kind she used to buy when she thought she'd be an artist. That night, sitting by the harbor window, she let the pencil move without agenda. The lines were rough at first, but soon shapes emerged, the curve of a fishing boat's hull, the tilt of a gull in flight. It felt like waking a part of herself she'd kept sedated for years. It was in the bookstore cafe that she met him, Peter, a retired architect traveling the coast to photograph lighthouses. He noticed her sketching and asked if he could see. They're nothing, she said, half closing the pad. They're honest, he replied, and she found herself smiling. They talked for hours about the way the ocean changed with the light, about books they'd both read decades apart, about the strange weight of dreams put aside for more practical things. His words didn't fill a gap, she wasn't looking for that, but they did mirror a hunger she recognized. By the 5th day she noticed she'd stopped counting how long she'd been away. The edges of her life back home blurred, no longer the constant frame around her thoughts. One evening, she returned from a wind-swept walk to find her phone blinking with a new message. Lily's name filled the screen. "Are you coming home soon?" No exclamation point, no emojis, just a question, stark and uncertain, as if the ground under it had shifted. Clara stood by the window, the harbor lights blinking in the dark, and felt the tug of two worlds, the one she'd always known and the one she was only beginning to claim. She didn't answer right away, letting the message sit between them like the tide coming in, going out, waiting to see which way she would step. Her call didn't guilt me, it empowered me. Morning came in slow layers of light over the harbor. Clara sat cross-legged on the bed, journal open on her lap, steam curling from the mug of tea at her side. She'd read Lily's message again before putting her phone face down on the nightstand. Not answering right away felt less like avoidance and more like taking a breath before speaking truth. Her pen hovered, then scratched across the page in a looping hand. "I've been measuring myself by her comfort for too long." She paused, watching the ink dry. The past few days in the town had felt like living inside a watercolor, edges soft, colors bleeding gently into each other. For the first time in years, she'd woken without a to-do list dictated by someone else's needs. No errands to run for Lily, no dinners to prepare for Ben, just hours that belonged entirely to her. She wrote about the long walks on the shore, the smell of fresh scones, the way her fingers had remembered how to shape a sketch without second-guessing. And then she wrote the things she hadn't dared to put into words until now. "If I have to shrink to fit into her life, then I don't belong there the way I thought I did." The realization didn't come with bitterness, only a strange, clean quiet. The conversation with Lily, once sharp in her memory, had lost its sting. It had been a wound, yes, but one that had let something trapped finally drain away. She flipped the page and drew a single line down the center on one side. The people she poured energy into on the other, the people who gave something back. The imbalance was almost comical in its starkness. The harbor bell tolled once, deep and resonant. Clara set the journal aside and picked up her phone. Her thumbs moved deliberately. "I'm still here, but we need boundaries." She read it twice, then hit send. No apology, no cushioning phrases to make it easier to swallow, just the truth, compact and unadorned. The screen stayed blank for several minutes. She dressed for the day, pulling on a navy sweater and her most comfortable walking shoes, and only when she'd slung her scarf around her neck did the phone buzz. "Lily, we need to talk when you get back." Clara stared at the message, noting the absence of warmth, but also the absence of dismissal. It wasn't gratitude, but it wasn't rejection either. It was space. A place to begin, perhaps. She tucked the phone into her bag and stepped outside. The air was sharp with salt and faint wood smoke, and the tide was pulling out, revealing the glistening scatter of shells along the sand. She walked until the houses grew sparse and the wind carried nothing but the sound of waves collapsing against the rocks. Here she let herself imagine the visit she'd promised in her mind, her walking into Lily's home, not as someone hoping for approval, but as a woman who could walk away if respect wasn't on offer. She would listen, but she wouldn't bend herself into new shapes to fit old expectations. A gull passed overhead, its shadow sliding across the wet sand. Clara bent to pick up a smooth piece of driftwood, turning it over in her hand before tucking it into her coat pocket. A reminder, she thought, that even what's been tossed around by the tides can still be whole. By the time she returned to her room, the light was shifting toward evening, turning the harbor gold. She opened her journal once more and wrote in a firm, unshaking hand, "I will visit her. I will hear her out. But I will not disappear into her life again." She capped the pen, slid the journal into her suitcase and closed it with a soft click. Outside, the harbor bell rang again, as Clara's phone lit up on the nightstand. Lily's message waiting, her words a thin bridge across a widening sea. I wasn't going back just to apologize. I was going to set a new precedent. The train ride home hummed with a low, steady rhythm, the landscape scrolling past in muted winter colors. Clara kept her journal in her lap, one hand resting lightly on its cover, the other cradling a cup of lukewarm coffee. The piece she carried felt unfamiliar, almost delicate, like glass she had to protect from shattering. But it was hers, and she wasn't about to hand it over at the first sign of conflict. When she stepped off at her stop, the cold wrapped around her in a familiar embrace. By the time she reached her car, she had already rehearsed the first lines of what she'd say to Lily, though she knew rehearsals never survived the real performance. They met at a quiet cafe halfway between their homes. Clara arrived first, choosing a table by the window. She ordered tea and kept her hands wrapped around the mug, watching the street outside until Lily appeared, her movements brisk but her smile careful. "Hi, Mom," she said, sliding into the seat opposite. Clara nodded, taking in the guarded eyes, the faint tightness in her daughter's jaw. "Thank you for meeting me. I thought we should talk," Lily replied, stirring her coffee with unnecessary precision. "About everything." Clara didn't lean forward or soften her tone. "I'm not here to smooth things over or pretend nothing happened," she said. "I'm here because if we're going to keep a relationship, it has to be a new one." Lily blinked, her hand stilling over the spoon. "A new one? One where respect isn't optional," Clara said. "Where honesty goes both ways. Where I'm not just convenient." Her daughter's gaze flickered downward, to the condensation ring her cup had left on the table. "I know I haven't been great about showing appreciation, but you can be," she hesitated, searching for the word. "A lot. Overbearing sometimes." The words should have stung, but they didn't, not the way they once might have. Clara only nodded. "Then let's find a balance. I'll give you space, but I will not be invisible." Something in Lily's posture shifted, the stiffness loosening just slightly. "I'm sorry for not appreciating you. I really am. I need to figure out how to take what you give, without feeling smothered." "That's on both of us," Clara said. "And I'm willing to do my part if you are." They let the silence settle between them for a moment, neither rushing to fill it. It wasn't agreement, not yet, but it wasn't rejection either. When they parted, it was with a hug that felt tentative but real. Clara walked back to her car lighter, not because the air between them was suddenly clear, but because she had kept herself intact inside it. That evening, still in her coat, she stopped by the small art supply store in town. The owner, a wiry man with paint permanently embedded in the lines of his hands, asked what she'd been working on lately. She showed him the sketches she'd made on her trip. Boats in the harbor, the curling edge of a tide, the gull mid-flight. He studied them longer than she expected. "You ever think about showing these?" She laughed. A small, surprised sound. "Showing them? No. They're good," he interrupted. "Real good. There's a gallery across town that does local showcases. I can put in a word." The suggestion landed like a stone dropped in still water rippling outward, making space for a possibility she hadn't even considered. That night, she set her sketch pad on the kitchen table, running her fingers over the pages. The thought of her work hanging on a wall, of strangers pausing to really look, stirred something equal parts excitement and terror. She picked up her phone, thumb hovering for a beat before typing. "I'm ready for something new, Lily. Are you?" She hit send, the echo of the gallery offer still humming in her mind, the question hanging between them like an open door. "I wasn't going to ask for approval. I was going to live unapologetically." The morning after sending her message to Lily, Clara stood in the center of her kitchen, the sketch pad still open on the table. The gallery owner's name, Margaret Lane, was scrawled in quick slanting handwriting on a slip of paper. It felt less like an invitation, and more like a key she'd been holding without realizing it fit a lock. By the end of the week, she was standing inside the gallery's sunlit front room, the air smelling faintly of turpentine and wood polish. Margaret was brisk and direct, walking her along the walls as if Clara had been doing this for years. "You have a way of catching motion," she said, stopping at a sketch of the gull Clara had drawn on her trip. "I want these framed, clean, simple wood, Nothing that fights with the line. Clara nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. Pride swelled in her chest. Pride without the usual shadow of will they like it. 2 days later, her phone rang while she was washing brushes. Lily's name lit the screen. For a moment, Clara considered letting it go to voicemail, but she answered. "Mom," Lily said, her voice softer than before. "I've been thinking about what you said, about everything." Clara let the words come, slow and careful, without filling the pauses. "I'm sorry," Lily said at last. "Not just for the blank, for making you feel like you weren't enough. You are." The sincerity was there, but Clara didn't let it unmoor her. "I appreciate you saying that," she said evenly. "But I'm done living my life in a way that depends on hearing it. I've had enough of seeking approval." Lily was quiet, then said, "I understand." When the gallery opening came, the air was charged with the hum of conversation and the faint clink of wine glasses. Clara wore a navy dress she hadn't taken out of the closet in years, the fabric skimming her in a way that felt like both armor and celebration. People drifted toward her work, pausing, leaning in. She heard fragments, so much movement in the lines. You can almost smell the ocean, and each one felt like a thread stitching her into a version of herself she'd only imagined. Halfway through the evening, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned and nearly laughed in surprise. "Sam?" He grinned, older around the eyes but still unmistakable, the boy she'd known in art class at 20, now a man with silver at his temples. "I saw your name on the flyer. I had to come. I always knew you'd end up doing this." They fell into easy conversation, the kind that didn't need backstory. Sam told her he'd been painting again after years of working construction. He asked if she'd join him at a local art co-op. "You should keep going," he said. "You have more to say. I can see it." By the end of the night, Clara's cheeks ached from smiling, but it wasn't the polite smile she'd perfected for other people's comfort. It was hers. Later at home she carried the first piece she'd ever framed, a charcoal sketch of the harbor at low tide, into her living room. She hung it above the mantel, stepping back until it settled perfectly in place. The room felt different now. Lighter, as if each line on the paper had pulled a weight from her shoulders and left it there, safely out of reach. She stood there for a long while, the sound of the quiet house wrapping around her. No phone in hand, no one waiting for her to play a part. Clara let her fingertips rest against the frame, and for the first time in her life, the word that filled her mind wasn't mother or wife or daughter. It was free. The letter came on a Tuesday, slipped through the mail slot with the rest of the bills and glossy fly. Clara noticed it immediately. Thick cream paper, her name written in bold, looping script she hadn't seen in over 20 years. She carried it to the kitchen, and sat at the table, fingertips resting on the envelope's edge. When she slid the letter free, the faint scent of turpentine and cedar oil rose up, and memory struck long afternoons in a sunlit studio, her mentor Ruth Holloway, pacing between easels, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Claire, I saw your work in the gallery newsletter. You've found your hand again. I want us to talk. There's a project that needs your voice in it." Clara read it twice, the words lifting something inside her that had been dormant for decades. She could picture Ruth's intense gaze, the way she would tilt her head just so before delivering both praise and critique in the same breath. She set the letter down carefully, as though it might bruise, and reached for her tea. This was something new, something that could tilt her life again. Her phone rang before she could decide whether to call Ruth right away. Lily's name flashed on the screen. Clara considered letting it pass, but curiosity won. "Hi, Mom." The voice was cautious, as though Lily wasn't sure which version of her mother she'd find on the other end. "I could use your advice." Clara leaned back in her chair. "About? Evan and I. We've been arguing. And I know you and Dad well, you always seem to figure things out. She broke off. "I don't know what to do." Clara could feel the familiar tug, that old reflex to drop everything, to become the safety net, but she didn't rush to fill the silence. "I'll listen," Clara said slowly, "but only if you're ready to really hear me. No interruptions. No defensiveness." There was a pause, then a quiet, "Okay." Lily spoke for nearly 15 minutes, her voice shifting from frustration to vulnerability. Clara listened, hands folded in her lap, waiting until the words ran out. "You can't fix a partnership by trying to be the other person's everything," Clara said when it was her turn. "And you can't demand they be yours. Respect is the floor you build from, not the ceiling you hope to reach." It was the kind of thing she might have said before, but this time it came without the weight of needing Lily to agree. Whether she took it in or not, that was Lily's choice. "Thank you," Lily said after a long moment, the words sounding less like politeness and more like they had root. When the call ended, Clara didn't feel drained. She felt steady. She realized she could be there for her daughter without folding herself into the shape Lily wanted. The week that followed was filled with gallery errands, choosing frames, preparing pieces for Ruth to see. She pulled out work she hadn't shown anyone, sketches from before her marriage, before Lily, before her identity had been reduced to roles she wore like layered coats. One afternoon, she stood at the easel in the sunlight, charcoal smudging her fingertips, and thought, "I am not their savior. I am my own." That night, she called Ruth. They spoke for nearly an hour, Ruth outlining the collaboration, a traveling exhibition of coastal artists, each piece telling a story of place and memory. Clara said yes before she even realized it, her pulse quickening at the thought of her work moving beyond her own wall. A few days later, the phone rang again. This time, it was Margaret from the gallery. "Clara," she said, her voice almost conspiratorial. "The board saw your work from the last show. They want you in the spring exhibition. It's one of the most prestigious events we do." Clara pressed the receiver closer, the sound of her own heartbeat loud in her ears. She set the phone down after the call, staring at her hands, the same hands that had once been only for knitting, cooking, caretaking, now invited to create for the world. Clara lined the edges of her dining table with sketches, watercolors and charcoal studies, each one a fragment of her last few months. The late afternoon light slid across them, catching in the graphite, deepening the indigo washes of the sea. She could feel her own pulse in the room, as if every piece carried a heartbeat. The spring exhibition was 3 days away, and for the first time in years, she wasn't rehearsing for approval, she was preparing for herself. She measured each mat, adjusted frames so they hung without a millimeter's tilt. Her confidence wasn't loud. It was a quiet, steady flame that warmed everything she touched. In the kitchen, water boiled for tea. She caught her reflection in the darkened window, chin lifted, eyes clear. The woman staring back didn't look like someone waiting to be invited in. She looked like someone who owned her place at the table. On the night of the event, the gallery's wide windows glowed against the spring dusk. Inside, light spilled over white walls and polished floors, the air bright with conversation. Clara stood near her section, the soft hum of admiration rippling around her as people leaned in to study her work. She was talking to a couple from out of town when she saw Lily walk in. No hesitation, just a steady step toward her. She wore a simple dress, hair pulled back, and when their eyes met, she smiled in a way that was different. No guardedness, no careful construction, just open. "Mom," Lily said, taking her hands, "this is incredible." Her gaze moved over the pieces, lingering, really looking. "I'm proud of you." The words landed without fanfare, but they rooted deep. Clara felt no rush of relief, only a warm acknowledgement. Respect, when it came without conditions, didn't demand anything in return. As the evening gathered momentum, Margaret tapped her on the arm. "It's time," she murmured. Clara stepped to the small podium near the center of the room. The crowd quieted. She let her hands rest on either side of the stand, feeling the grain of the wood under her fingers. "I never thought I'd be here," she began, her voice carrying in the stillness. "Not because I didn't want it, but because for a long time, I forgot I was allowed to want it." She spoke about the years of creating in private, of letting her own desires shrink to fit the shape of other people's needs. She spoke about finding her way back to herself, not all at once, but in the small, stubborn acts that stitched her together again. "My legacy isn't just in these pieces," she said, gesturing to the walls. "It's in learning that I can change without disappearing, that I can love others without abandoning myself." The applause rose slowly at first, then gathered into something warm and sustained. She saw faces smiling back at her, not just seeing her art, But seeing her later, with the crowd thinned and the chatter softened, Clara moved through the room, speaking with the last few guests. Lily was by the doorway, talking to Ben, both of them looking relaxed in a way that felt new. She had just turned toward the refreshment table, when the gallery door opened again. A man in a tailored jacket stepped in, scanning the space until his eyes found hers. He was older, with a salt and pepper beard, and the kind of posture that came from walking into rooms expecting to be heard. "Clara Dawson," he asked, his voice low but certain. "Yes?" He offered a hand, the corners of his mouth lifting. "I'm Daniel Hart. I curate for the National Coastal Arts Foundation. I think your work belongs on a bigger stage." Clara felt the room narrow to the space between them, her fingers still wrapped around his handshake, the next chapter hovering, waiting to be claimed. The following week unfolded like the start of a novel Clara had always wanted to write. Daniel Hart's visit had been brief, but potent. 3 days later, an email arrived from his assistant, formal and precise, inviting her to participate in a group exhibition at a major gallery in New York. The name of the gallery alone carried weight. Even Clara, who had spent years outside the art world, knew it. She read the message twice, her hands trembling just enough to make the screen blur. By the end of the day, she'd replied yes. Preparations began immediately. Margaret helped her select which pieces to send, advising on shipping, framing and press materials. Clara's small home became a bustling workshop, crates leaning against walls, rolls of bubble wrap unfurled across the floor, labels handwritten with care. Each piece felt like a chapter of the story she was ready to tell on a bigger stage. One afternoon, she heard a knock and opened the door to find Lily, cheeks flushed from the cool air. "I wanted to see you before you get swept away," Lily said, stepping inside. She glanced at the chaos, art supplies and shipping boxes and smiled. "It's amazing, Mom. Really, I'm proud of you." Clara set down the tape dispenser and looked at her daughter. "Thank you, but you know," she hesitated, then let the words come. "I'm not just your mom anymore. I'm me, and I think I've always needed you to see that." Lily nodded slowly. "I do now." They shared tea at the kitchen table, the conversation easy, almost companionable. Clara could feel the past still there between them, but it no longer pressed down like it used to. It was simply part of the architecture they both lived inside. The day she boarded the train for New York, she carried only what mattered, a suitcase of clothes, a small leather sketchbook, and the knowledge that she was walking into a future on her own terms. The city met her with its usual brash energy, horns, voices, the scent of roasting nuts from a street cart. Her apartment was small but airy, with a single north-facing window perfect for a work table. She unpacked slowly, placing her brushes in a ceramic cup, stacking her sketch pads, hanging one framed harbor sketch above the desk. The gallery space itself was all glass and white walls, its ceilings high enough to make her pieces feel almost weightless. On opening night, the crowd buzzed, moving from one work to the next with the slow reverence of people who knew they were seeing something worth remembering. For once, she wasn't scanning faces for approval, she was simply inhabiting the moment. The laughter, the quiet murmurs, the way strangers paused in front of her work, as if reluctant to move on, it all belonged to her too. A week later, she was packing for a short trip back home to collect a few more belongings, when an envelope arrived, heavy and cream-colored like the one from Ruth. The return address was a law office. Inside, on thick stationery, the letter read, "Dear Miss Dawson, we are writing to inform you that you have been named a beneficiary in the estate of Sarah Whitcomb." Clara sat back in her chair, stunned. Sarah. Once her closest friend, later an absence marked by silence neither had bridged. They hadn't spoken in years, not since the falling out that had seemed final, and yet here in neat legal language was the fact. Sarah had left her a significant portion of her estate. No explanation, no conditions, just a final gesture of recognition. Clara closed her eyes and let the air move in and out of her lungs, steady and full. The past, it seemed, had its own way of finding resolution. She placed the letter on the desk beside her sketchbook. There was work to be done, a train to catch, a life waiting in two places at once. Clara stepped out into the New York morning, the streets opening ahead, her future bright, her past quietly, finally at peace. The first snow of the season drifted past Clara's New York window, softening the edges of the city below. She sat at her work table, a mug of coffee cooling beside her, the letter from the law office tucked neatly into a drawer. It no longer felt like an unanswered question. It felt like a closed chapter she could place on the shelf without bitterness. Her latest piece lay before her, charcoal still smudging the heel of her hand, a wide open shoreline under a restless sky. It wasn't a perfect rendering of any single place she'd been. It was pieces of them all, the coastal town, the pier, the curve of the harbor, stitched together into something that felt like her own reflection. The knock at the door startled her. A courier stood there with a slim envelope embossed with the seal of the National Gallery of Modern Art. She slid it open, scanning the neat black type. "We are honored to include your work in our spring feature on contemporary coastal expression." Clara read it twice, not because she didn't believe it, but because she wanted to feel the words settle into her bones. The recognition didn't feel like a rescue or a validation. It was simply a mirror reflecting back what she had already begun to know. That evening she called Lily. The conversation began with updates on weather, on Ben's latest woodworking project, and then Lily said almost shyly, "I'd like to come to your next show, not just to see your work, to see you." There was no performance in her voice, no careful choice of words, just an offering. Clara accepted it without the old ache of needing to read between the lines. Weeks later, the gallery opening glowed like a living thing. Lights washed over the pale walls, catching on frames and glass, the hum of voices creating a warm undercurrent. Clara wore deep green silk, the color of seaweed in clear water. She felt the weight of it on her shoulders, steady and grounding. Lily arrived midway through the evening, weaving her way through the crowd, until she was standing beside her mother. "They're breathtaking," she said, eyes on the wall. "You've always been good, but now you're fearless." Clara smiled. "I finally gave myself permission to be." They stood side by side in comfortable silence, watching as strangers leaned in toward the work. Clara felt no urge to explain the pieces, no compulsion to direct the viewer's gaze. The art could speak for itself, just as she finally could. As the night deepened, Margaret raised a glass in Clara's direction. "Our featured artist this evening," she announced to the crowd, "reminds us that the sea changes its shape, but never loses its depth. Please welcome Clara Dawson." The applause was warm, wrapping around her as she stepped forward. She didn't launch into the long story of how she'd arrived here. Instead, she let her voice carry with simple truth. "I used to think the work itself was the point. Now I know it's the courage to be seen that matters. The art is only the wreck." There was a stillness after she spoke, the kind that meant people were holding her words in their hands for a moment before letting them go. When the crowd dispersed and the gallery began to empty, Clara walked once more through the exhibit. She stopped at her newest piece, the shoreline under the restless sky, and tilted her head. It no longer looked like a question. It looked like an answer. The next morning she received a call from Daniel Hart. His voice carried the brisk excitement of someone delivering good news. "Clara, your work has been selected for the International Coastal Retrospective. It's a prestigious showcase, museum scale. You'll be alongside some of the biggest names in the field." Clara's gaze moved to the snow still drifting past her window. The city was hushed, the light clean and new. She realized her life no longer felt like it was waiting for permission. Months later she stood in the grand hall of the retrospective, her newest work lit like a beacon, her transformation not only complete, but claimed. The applause rose again, and this time she didn't think of the past at all. The grand hall of the retrospective was still quiet when Clara arrived early that morning. Sunlight streamed in through vaulted windows, spilling across the polished floor and warming the cool white wall. Her newest piece, a sweeping layered canvas of ocean, sky and shore, stood alone at the far end, lit so that every brushstroke carried its own small shadow. It was the largest work she had ever attempted, not in size alone, but in scope. Every place she had been lived inside it. The first coastal village where she'd walked alone. The New York skyline glimpsed through studio glass, the remembered tilt of a gull's wing over water. It wasn't just a landscape, it was a map of her becoming. She walked toward it slowly, her heels clicking softly. The colors seemed to shift with each step, deep blues and grays giving way to light warm gold where the horizon broke open. This was no longer just her art, this was her life, fully realized. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, the screen lit with Lily's name. Clara hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mom," Lily said, her voice steady but threaded with something softer. "I've been thinking about all of it. I'm sorry, not just for the blanket or for the years I took you for granted. I'm sorry for making you feel like you had to fight for space in my life." Clara listened, letting the words move through her without the old weight of expectation. "Thank you, Lily," she said at last. "I accept your apology." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "And I forgive you not because I've forgotten, but because I don't carry it anymore." On the other end, Lily exhaled, almost in relief. "I'm glad," she said quietly. When the call ended, Clara stood there for a moment with the phone still in her hand, feeling only lightness. The past wasn't something to drag forward, it was something to learn from, then set down. The day passed in a series of small bright moments. She spoke with other artists about new projects. A photographer from Lisbon asked if she'd collaborate on a book pairing images with her drawing. Margaret introduced her to a sculptor who invited her to visit a coastal residency in Maine. Clara felt herself saying yes, not to everything, but to what mattered. Later that week, she met Peter, the lighthouse photographer from the coastal town, for coffee. They talked easily, like old friends. Not every conversation had to lead somewhere. Some could just be shared warmth in a winter afternoon. In her studio she began new work without hesitation. A series of smaller pieces capturing movement rather than place. Her brushstrokes were looser now, more confident. She painted without the need to prove anything, trusting that the act itself was enough. One evening, she stood on the terrace of her apartment with a glass of wine. The city stretched out below. Somewhere behind her, the unfinished canvases waited. Somewhere ahead, there were places she hadn't yet been, people she hadn't yet met, work she hadn't yet imagined. She thought about the woman she had been when she first picked up her knitting needles for the blanket, measured by what she could give away. And then she thought about the woman she was now, measured only by how fully she could live her own life. The horizon beyond the rooftops glowed with the last light of the day, the sky that same restless gold she'd painted into her final piece. Clara smiled, not at an ending, but at the certainty that there were still beginnings left to claim. She turned back toward the studio, the city lights flickering to life around her, and stepped inside, her next chapter waiting, her journey only just beginning.